Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. In this video we will see how to build from scratch an application that will be able to provide an interactive quiz, process an answer based on user inputs, and save these inputs within a database. So if we go on VS Code, we can see that on our DB folder there is a new JSON file where we can find all the user input. So what we are waiting for? Let's go and build this application together. During this video I will explain every function step by step. At the end of this video you will learn some JavaScript fundamentals like DOM manipulation and a way to keep your JavaScript code tidy and clean. You will also understand how to build a little logic that plays under the scene of our application. You will learn what are buffer objects and how to send data from your browser to a NodeJS server using only Node.js without any framework. I want to thank you for being here and I hope that you will enjoy this kind of content because it took me a ton of work to get it done. As usual, you can find the source code and all the useful links in the description below. Okay. First of all, we need to set up our backend, so let's start to create a server.js file. This is the very basic setup that you can find in the About section of the Node.js website, so we will go straight to the end of this step. Note that this function uses the ECMAScript 6 notation, but we can also write this function in this way. Let's start our script. And go on the browser to see if the server is working okay. Okay, now we are connected on localhost on port 3000. Before we move to render our HTML, let's start to write a function that will help us during our project. You can decide to put this function in a different file or just do like me and write it at the very end of the file. It's up to you. I will call this section helpers functions. This function in particular will allow us to read the file inside our root folder. So let's call this function read static function that accept a file name and a call back. So we need to use the fs module, in particular the read file method, fs.readFile. We need to use the dirname method, that is a Node.js built-in method that gives us the path of the root folder, plus file name, okay, and a function that will give us back error and data. So if there is no error and there is data, we can call back data, as we can call back the error. Now we can start to write an HTML file and write inside it a bunch of HTML only for testing purpose. Now, if we want to start to render our HTML files on our browser, we only need to use the read static function that we set up a moment ago. So read static, we need to pass a path, that is the path that the file that we want to read, and a function that will give us back the data. So if we do like so, we change this to HTML and we will pass the data. We can try to restart our server. If we go on our browser and refresh the page, if you open the source code, you can see that we have already rendered our HTML. Now we can render out our HTML. So we are ready to set up a very basic user interface that will help us to go ahead in our heroic enterprise. The first goal that we want to achieve is to build our UI. First of all, we need to configure our server so it will be able to understand the CSS file and JavaScript file. To do that, we can start to grab the URL from the request object. To do that, we can start to use our read static function to read our frontend files. So let's start to write an if condition. Rec URL is equal to the file that we want actually read, app.css. Read static, okay, app.css, and a function that gives us back the data that we read inside the file. Now we can set up the response header, set header, content type, like text CSS, this is the meme type for CSS, and the response, the end of the response that gives us back the data inside the files. Now the only thing that we must do is to complete the else statement and correct this little typo. To complete the else statement, we must cut this piece of code and paste it inside the else statement. Before we go ahead, we need to save our server.js file. We need to create an app.css files. Okay, we can write inside of it some instruction like h1 color red. And last one, we need to link our CSS file on our HTML file. Okay, I think that it's already set up. We need only to start our server. So write node server.js. If we go on port 3000, we must see that our CSS has been applied. Okay, the last setup that we must do before we start to build our UI is to make our server understand JS file. We can do this using the same statement we have already used for the CSS file. So after the if statement, we need to set up an else if statement where we check if the rec URL is equal to app.js. Now we need only to copy this piece of statement. We need to change the file extension, we need to change the meme type. Okay, and we save our server.js file. After this, we need to create an app.js file in our root folder. Let's write inside of it comment I'm the main.js file. Okay, and the last thing that we must do is to link the app.js file in our HTML. So script app.js. In our script tag, we want to include the defer attribute that is set to indicate to a browser that the script is meant to be executed after the document has been parsed, but before firing the DOM content loaded. So, in this way, we can obtain the same effect as we have declared this script tag at the very end of our HTML page, but before the closing body tag. Now, we must save our index.html file and restart our server. So, node server.js, and we refresh the page. Okay. We need to inspect the HTML and to click OK in our app.js file. Now we need to inspect this page with the developer tools. We need to click on the tab network of our browser. We need to reload this page. If we go here, we can see that this is okay. We have 200 status code back and we have a content type JavaScript text. I want to be clear that this is not the best way to set up a Node.js server. At the moment, we don't care about many security improvements that we should have. In addition, we have an hard-coded backend that would be impossible to maintain with a very large application. So, now we can start to build our front end. If you are not interested in front-end stuff, you can directly skip this section and go to the backend one. If you have already seen some of my previous video, you may know that I like to use SASS to write the HTML style. If you want to have a better understanding of SASS or you are completely new to it, I have an entire video that will help you to set up SASS on your machine. So, let's create an app.scss file. CSS, okay, and we need to open a new terminal and write SASS --version. This will print out our SASS version installed on our machine, and after that you need to write SASS --watch app.scss app.css --style compressed. As you can see, an app.css.map has appeared on our root folder. So only for testing purpose, we can write some code in our app.scss file, like so. h1 color blue. Let's save it. We see that the file is compiled. If we go on our Node.js application and we refresh the page, we can see that our app.scss file has compiled properly our app.css file. So let's start to build our UI. Since that for now we don't need to restart our server, I will use the live server extension that will apply our CSS style every time that we save the file. In this way, we don't have every time to refresh the page to see our changes. So let's start the server, live server extension. If we go on localhost, okay, the server is running on localhost 50,000 and 50,000. So we can see that the H1 is red. Now if I change this color to orange and I will save the file, without refreshing the page, the H1 become orange. Okay, let's start to create the markup for our app. If you are using VS Code, you must know that emmet abbreviation are enabled by default. This feature can save us from writing a ton of HTML every time. For example, you can do something like this if you want to create a div with a specific class. As you can see, emmet creates for us a div with the class that we have specified before. Or maybe you want to create a button inside a div. You can do like so, button, sorry, div, okay, button. As you can see, we have a button inside the div, or maybe you can combine the two. You can do class a button with class button. As you can see, here we have a button with class button inside a div with class. Okay, let's go ahead and start to create our markup. Okay, let's get rid of this. Let's adjust the zoom. Okay, now let's go ahead writing all the necessary stuff. Okay, now that we have filled up all the questions, we must set up the form submission method. So we need to go here and type method, okay, post, okay, and we only need to add the title inside the title container as an h1, like so, and write let's found your perfect mic, and save the index.html file. Before we move on to the styling part, we need to add the submit button, which is very important for the form submission. Submit value submit, and just after the form we need to add a div with class change slider container. That will be the container for our slider buttons that will help us to go ahead with our questions, like so. Okay, let's get rid of this and start to build our single page application style. I usually start my SCSS with some basic reset and all the project variables, sizing, mixin, and so on. If you are new to web development, you should know that every HTML element has a proper behavior that can destroy your layout if you don't tell the browser what to do with that specific behavior. So we can go ahead and let's start to build our basic CSS reset. After our SCSS reset, we can continue to write all the variables and all the mixin. Mixin are nothing more than pieces of code that you can reuse along with your SCSS file. So we can go ahead and write all the variables. Okay, let's save our file and go ahead and style all the single page application. The first thing that we want to do is to style the main section, so we can apply the following rules. We have a main section, as you can see is here, main section, okay, and we want to apply a relative position. We want to include our main layout. We want a width of 100%, margin auto, and a min height of 100 VH. we want to include our media query. Okay, but at the moment we need to solve an issue because we want to include on our single page application a background image that will cover all the background, but our server is not able to understand image. To do that, we need to change our server.js file. The first thing that we want to do is to create a new folder, and we can call this folder img. In this folder, we go to put our image. We need to open our server.js file and write another else if statement. We want to read our image when the rec URL is equal to img mic1.jpg. Okay, we need to read the file. We need to set the meme type for image. So content type image JPG, and we want to send back the data. So in this way our server can understand image file, and now we can include in our app.scss our mic1.jpg image. In this way, we want to include background image URL. We need to include our URL, img mic, okay. Background position center, background repeat, no repeat, background size cover. Okay, let's save our file, and as you can see, our image has been applied to our single page application. Okay, now let's go straight to style our application. We will slow down when there is something important to see. Okay, now that we have finished to style our form, we can explain better what we have done here. So, as you can see from our index.html, for every question we have an input container, and inside this input container we have 4 divs with class choices, and inside every div we have a checkbox input. Okay, let me explain the trick that will make you sure that the selection of the answer always goes well. So, if we inspect our page with the developer tools and we inspect our input, we can see that our checkbox input has the same area as the choices div. So, this means that the selection of the answer is successful even if the user does not click directly on our checkbox. If you want to clearly see these things, you can get rid of this opacity and you can try to click away from your checkbox input, and as you can see, you will obtain the same result as you have clicked directly on your checkbox input. The last thing that we must do before we finish our style is to style our back and next buttons. So now that we finished to style our application, we can go ahead with the crunchy part. and jump to the app.js file where we can add all the functionalities to our single page application. So let's start to build our client JavaScript. Usually I start my app.js file by creating an app container that is nothing more than an object where I can store all my function. So let app is equal to an empty object, and we can add app.init, init that is equal to a function, app.init. Okay, this kind of approach helps me to maintain my code cleaner and become very powerful when your code starts becoming bigger and bigger. So the first goal that we want to achieve is to give our users the possibility to change question using the two buttons next and back. So let's create the first function, change slide, change question. So let's explain what's going on here. As you can see, all slides containing the question are disappeared except one. This happens because at the very top of our change question section, we have declared a slide index variable equal to 1. So when the script is executed, these if statements cannot be verified and will be executed only the for loop that will loop through our slide, setting the display style to none. After that will be executed this line of code that will apply the display style equal to an empty string, which is equal to say unset in CSS, which shows up the slide with index 0. So if we inspect with the developer tools our page and we go on the slide, we can see that all the slides have a display style set to 1 except the first one, which is the one with an index equal to 0. Now the only thing that we must do is to allow the user to change slide using these two buttons. So let's write a function and we can call this function app.plusSlide. That will be a function that accepts a number, and inside this function we will call app.changeQuestion, and we will pass the slide index increased by that number. So let's save our app.js file and go in our index.html file, and we need to add to every button a onClick event where we call our plus function. So app plus slide. We need to pass in the back button -1 and in the next button 1, because when we hit the back button we want that the slide index decrease, and when we hit the next button we want that the slide index increase. So let's save our index.html file and let's test if all is working okay, and it seems that all is working okay. So before we move on to build other function, I want just only to add a little bit of style to this choices div, because I'd like to have a border around these choices. So border 1 pixel solid, and we have to add the main colors, let's say, and now we can see that we have a nice border for every choices inside our form. The next goal we want to achieve is to highlight a choice when we click on it, so that we know what choices we made for each question. Let's build this function and we can call it highlight. Now let's explain what's going on here. We have taken from the DOM all choices using the query selector all method, and the form using the query selector method. The major difference between the two is that the first one returns an iterable object while the second one selects exactly the element we request. In this case, since in our application there are no other forms, I used the HTML tag, otherwise I could have assigned a class to the form tag and selected through that. After that, we added an event listener to the forms that listen for click events. In this line, through the function this, we are assigning to the variable elements all inputs contained within the form. Through the if condition, we verify to select the input that are of the checkbox type and that have been selected, and we are going to give them a white background color and a black font color. Through the second condition, we make sure that if the user clicks again on a choice made previously, it returns to have the transparent background. If we test our function, we can see that this function is working okay. Now that we have set up the basic function of our UI, we can start to build some logic that will play under the scene. But before we go ahead, we need to go into our index.html file and replace this IDs attribute that I forgot before. You have my apologies, but I didn't realize that I didn't change these values. So we need to do this value and this value. Let's save and let's go to build our logic. The first thing we must do to add some logic to our single page application is to store all the user's answer inside an object. So let's start to create a function that will store all the user's answer. Store the user answers. So app store answers is a function. Okay. So, in order to store all users' answer, the first thing we must do is to create an empty object. After that, we can grab our form using the query selector method and assign to the elements variable all the form elements. Through the for loop, we will take only the elements that are different from the submit type and that are checked. Inside the for loop, we push our answer inside our empty object like pairs of key and values. And at the end of the function, we want back our payload object. So now, only for testing purpose, we need to trigger our function when the forms will be submitted. So we need to grab the form and we need to add an event listener to it that listens for a submit event. We need to pass a function with an event. We need to pass, the first thing that we want to do is to use the prevent default method. That will allow us to avoid the form default behavior after a submit event, like redirecting the user to another URL or reloading the page. And then we can call our store answers function. So app.storeAnswers. Okay, let's save our file. Let's try to send some answers. Submit. Okay. Now we can go to inspect. As you can see here, we have an object containing all the user's answers. So, in order to give back to the user an answer based on his input, we need to set up this kind of logic. We want to count how many times he picked up the A answer, the B answer, and so on. In this way, we can count the choices he picked up more times and give him an answer based upon the more frequent choices he made. So if we go on our complete app, we want to achieve a result like this. Let's say A, B, C. You can see that we picked up the A mic. If we do the quiz another time and we do, let's say, B, 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 D, A, you can see that we picked up the B mic. The first thing we must do to achieve this goal is to grab 4 mic photos and insert them inside our HTML and inside our img folder. I have already prepared these photos and we can start to put them inside our img folder. Okay, as you can see, now we have 4 new photos. So before we move on to add the new HTML markup for our photos, we need to update our server.js file because our Node.js server is not able to understand our new images. As I said before, this is not the best way to set up a Node.js server, but this is a fast way to get our app done. Okay, let's go. The only thing we need to do is to paste this as if statement as many times as there are images in our folder. So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, and we need only to update the path and if needed, like the last one, the extension. Let's save our server.js file and let's try to add an image in our index.html file, only for testing purpose. img mic dot, let's save, and as you can see, our layout got messed up, but now we can see that all is working okay. So let's get rid of this img tag. Let's save our index.html, and now is all ready to add the new HTML markup for our new images. Okay, the effect that we want to obtain is to make our quiz disappear when the user submits the form and brings up in its place our photos. So let's zoom a little bit out before. Okay, to do this we need to create 4 photos container, and inside each container we need to insert our images and a little text that will tell to the users what kind of mic he picked up. So as we do before, we can use our emact abbreviation to achieve this goal fastly. So let's create a div with class photo, and inside this div we want an img tag and a p tag, and we want to do these things 4 times, like so. Okay, after this we must add the path of the images and save our HTML. So okay, first one, second one, third one, and last one. Let's save our index.html. Okay, as you can see, our layout is completely messed up, but don't worry, with a little bit of CSS and JavaScript, we will recover our previous configuration. The first thing we must do is to add some style, so let's go in our SCSS file and update it. So let's go here. We need to go just above our main section. And as you can see, our photos looks much better. Now we need to hide our photo and makes them show up only when the users will finish our quiz. So let's add to the photo container a class that represents the photo that we want when the users finish the quiz, and an invisible class that set up them invisible by default. So we need to go in our index.html. So this is the photo for the answer A, for the answer B, for the answer C, and for the answer D. And we want to add an invisible class. Invisible. Let's save our HTML, and now we need to go in our app.css. Let's add the invisible class, invisible display known with the exclamation mark. Okay, let's save our app.scss file, and as you can see, our layout has been recovered. Okay, our next goal is to count how many times the user hit each answer. To do this, we need to write a function that will build for us an object that contains like 2 times B, 1 times A, and so on. So let's call our function response object. So let's explain better. In the first part, we have declared our empty response object. We store inside a variable named payload all the user answer, and we convert the payload object into an array. After that, we have looped through our array to count each question. Here, we do nothing more than assign key equals to the letter of the answer and append the value to the count function. Now we must test our function, so we can place it inside our submit event and try it out. Let's go. We need to console log our response object function because it returns the response object. So we need to do console log app.response object. Okay, and save it. Now we can try to give some random answer. Submit. We go to inspect with the developer tools in the console. Okay, as you can see, we have an object containing all the user answer. In this case, we have 1A, 2B, 2C, and 0D. Okay, now that we built this function, we can try to render out our photos based on this object. So, before we move on with the last function of the frontend part, I forgot to add in the index.html our paragraph under our images. So, let's add it. So the last things that we must do before we move on the backend part is to make the browser understand which answer has more values. Let's go and build our last frontend function. So let's explain what's happened here. In the first part of the function, we have taken all the DOM elements. After that, we have called the response object. We have passed the response object through the object keys method. After that, we have used the reduce method in order to get back a string containing the letters with the bigger numbers of answer. At this point, we only compare our results variable to make our photo container invisible or visible. The last thing that we must do before we can try out our quiz is to create the visible class, which allows us to give the users the correct photo and to add to our submit event our quiz result function. So let's add the visible class. Okay, we want to include centered column. We want a width of 60% and a margin auto. After this, we only need to update our app.js file. Let's cut this piece of code and let's pass it just before our init function. And now the last thing that we must do is to call our quiz result function inside our submit event. So we can do app.quizResult. Okay, let's save, and now we can try out our quiz. So A, B, A. Yes, let's go. Our front end is working okay, perfect. We can try another times. So C, D, okay, perfect. Now that our front end is ready, we can pass to the backend part, where we build together a small database where we can store all the users' answers. It's finally time to build our backend database. Before we move on to the next part, we need to deactivate the Visual Studio Code Live extension, since we need to restart our server every time we change our server.js file. So, okay, we need to save our app.js file. We need to open a new terminal and we need to node server.js. Okay, now we can call localhost 3000. In order to send data to our Node.js server, we need to send this data from the client. So before starting to change our server.js file, we need to build a function on our client side that can send data to our backend. We can call this function send data to server. So let's close this window. Let's add another function. We can call this function send data to server. So app.sendData to server is a function. The first thing that we want to do is to grab all the user answers. So let payload app.store answer. After that, we need to initialize our new XML HTTP request. So xhr is equal to new XML HTTP request. After this, we need to open the request with the open method, and we need to pass the method that we want to use to send data to our server and the URL. We need to stringify our payload, so let payload string is equal to json.stringify. We need to pass payload. After that, the last thing that we want to do is for first to console log our payload string. Okay. And then the last thing that we want is to send the data to our server. So xhr.send. We need to pass our payload string. Okay. The last thing that we must do is to call our app.sendData to server in our submit event. So we can try out our quiz. If we inspect with the developer tools, we can see that we have our string with all the questions that we have just already inserted. Okay, now we can go to our server.js file and make all the changes that we need to build our database. So let's go on our server.js file and start to build two functions that will help us in the data storing process. The first function that we want to build is a function that will allow us to create a random string of a given length. We will use this function to give every file a unique file name. I want to insert this function in the helper section, so we can get rid of this. We can say let create random string is equal to function Now let's explain this function. This function will accept an argument that will be the length of the random string that we want to create. In the first line, we are using a condensed way to say nothing more than the string length argument must be a number and its length must be greater than 0. And here we are saying that we want back the string length, otherwise we set that value to false. If there is the string length, we can store inside a variable all the possible characters that our function can use to build our random string. After that, we have to initialize the string and we have to start a for loop which loops through all the possible characters using the char@at method, which give us back the single characters that match in the index argument that we pass through it. So let's say that here we do a char@, and instead we pass all this code, we pass the number 5. This method gives us back the F letters of the possible character strings, because 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? So as index we are passing nothing more than an integer random number calculated by the product between the mathRandom method, which gives us a random number between 0 and 1, and our string length. In this way, we are able to select every time random characters, and in the last line we append it to our empty string. So let's try out our create random string. We can say here console.log, and we can say create random string, and we want a 20 character length string. So let's save our server.js. We need to open our node terminal. We need to stop our server running and restart it. So node server.js. And as you can see here, I zoom a little bit in. And as you can see, we have a 20 character long string. Okay, now it's finally time to build the logic that will store our users' data into our database. But before we start to build this function, we need to create a database folder in our main root. So db, and we need to import another Node.js module that will allow us to decode the byte data that the client sent to our server. So we need to call this module constring decoder is equal to require string decoder dot string decoder. Before we continue, I want to explain why we need this module. We need this module because our client can send data to our server using a stream of data that is sent like a buffers. Buffers are used to represent a fixed length sequence of bytes, but we will explain better these things in a moment. Let's go to build our function. As you can see here, we want to trigger our function when the request URL is equal to the URL that as you can see here, we want to trigger our function when the request URL is equal to the URL that we put inside our XHR open method in our app.js. So if we go here, I mean this, okay? In the first line, we have initialized an empty string named buffer. Here we are assigning to our decoder variable the string decoder module. The string decoder modules provide an API for decoding buffer object into strings in a manner that preserves encoded multi-byte UTF-8 and UTF-16 characters. The simple way to explain this is that this API does nothing more than to convert our buffer object, which I remember is a fixed length sequence of bytes, into strings. If you want to see what a buffer looks like, we can console log it in our server.js file before the decoding process. So console.log data, okay. Let's save our server.js file. We need to start our server, so node server.js. Okay, we need to refresh the page. If we try to complete our form, our quiz, and we will submit it, okay. Now you can see that here there is a buffer object, and if we go in our DB, we can see that we have our JSON file containing all the answers that we perform in our quiz. So now we can try to console log after the decoding process our buffer, so console.log buffer. Okay, let's save. Let's refresh the page. Let's restart our Node.js server. Okay, Node server.js. Okay, we can try to do another times our quiz. Okay, now you can see that we have the data here, and here we have our string, okay, that is our buffer variables here, sorry, and we have another JSON file containing all the answers that we perform in our quiz. So let's continue to explain our function. Here we have set up our server to listen for the data event when a request comes in, and to append this data to our buffer strings here with the write method of the decoder module. And here we have set up an end event which listens to the end of the data streams. Here we only need to check if our buffer contains some data, so we check that the buffer length is greater than 0. Now we can go to create our files. Let's zoom out. Here you can see that through the fs open method we have created a new file inside our db folder named with the create random string function that we created a moment ago. We set up a JSON file, then we have only attached a strings with the JSON extension. We are able to create the file in the meantime that we are opening it, because we are using these little strings which represent the open method for the files, and then we pass a function that gives us back an error and data. Okay, we don't care about the error, but I remember to you that this is the wrong way to program a server, and that here we are using this configuration only to get the app done and to explain to you what kind of possibility you have using Node.js. Lastly, we have writing on the file our buffer string with the write file method and closing that file with the close method of the fs module. Now, if we refresh the page and we get rid of our console log here, and here, we can save our server.js files. We can We start the server, so node server.js. Okay, we need to refresh our page. We can try to give some random answers and then submit the form. Okay, as you can see here, another file has appeared. So this is the end of this tutorial. If you watched this video upon this point, I want to thank you so much because it took a ton of work to make this video. Knowing that I have helped someone is a great satisfaction. If you want to see more content like this, please hit the like button and leave a comment below. See you the next one.